So this session is entitled Zero Trust Architecture in HPC and AI Environments. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan McRonald. I work for the University of Victoria, and I am the National Security Council representative for the Arbutus Cloud site. Thank you for joining this session, and let me introduce our speakers. But before that, as we proceed with our webinar session today, it is with acknowledgement of the First Nations, Inuit and Métis nations, and communities who have been harmed by colonial and unethical research, and of the data sovereignty and research priorities of these nations and communities. On behalf of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, we commit to understanding and taking our role in reducing harm and advancing reconciliation in research. In terms of a code of conduct for the session, the Alliance seeks to provide a welcoming and engaging, safe community for everyone. Discriminatory language is not appropriate in any venue or platform. The Alliance does not tolerate harassment. Harassment is understood as any behavior that threatens another person or a group or produces an unsafe environment. We thank you in advance for your ongoing efforts to keep our environment safe and welcoming. And now let me introduce our presenters. So firstly, we have Tyson McCauley. Tyson is an active security researcher and lecturer at Carleton University, specializing in critical infrastructure protection. Tyson has a personal syllabus of 4 books, dozens of periodical publications, international standards, contributions, several registered patents, and continues to support the development of engineering and security standards through volunteer efforts in the International Standards Organization, the Professional Engineers of Ontario, and various board positions. Tyson has worked extensively in cybersecurity, with networking, data centers, high-performance computing, and blockchain. And also, allow me to introduce Dashka Bashkar. Dashka is a principal security architect at Navy Federal Credit Union. She has over 20 years of experience in software and telecommunications industries and multinationals such as Microsoft, Comcast, NBC Universal, and Bell Canada. She has worked with complex carrier-grade systems and security architectures, and she's passionate about securing emerging technologies, engaging with the broader community, and to better the state of technical security architectures. So with that, I will pass over the slides to Tyson.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. So I will now share the screen, and shortly we'll also share well, I'll share it now. For those that want to follow along in the chat window, this is the live deck with a lot of embedded resources, and I will publish this a second time in case there's any late stragglers. So thank you very much. To begin the presentation, Dax and I have both already been introduced. We met quite a while ago at Bell Canada when we were both working there, and we've maintained a research relationship since that time. I focus a lot of my work now through Carleton's National Center for Critical Infrastructure Protection, and there'll be more references to that because the source materials are actually housed there. Daksha, is there anything more you'd like to say?
Just thank you so much for having us as part of the Cybersecurity Awareness Month activities. So glad to be here.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, everybody, this is actually the second time we're doing this presentation. We did it last year, and we've substantially updated everything since that time. And actually, a lot of this presentation will be about what's changed in the last year and things that have evolved when it comes to HPC security, because it's a very active field, as you can imagine. To begin with, we just wanted to mention the scope, because to the point about this being a very active field of engagement, we are talking about HPC and AI infrastructure. Everything from physical access, the operational technology, firmware, operating systems, the chassis, the clusters, the arrays, and more specifically, the standards as they exist, which are almost all entirely from NIST in the US, about protecting these infrastructure assets. What we are not really focusing on are some of the software layer issues around security. In fact, we're not focusing on them. So there's a lot of great work being done and problems being discussed and addressed: prompt injections, model protection, exfiltration issues. All of those are covered in separate sorts of documents, like the AI risk management framework from NIST, some emerging ISO standards like 42001. We're not here to talk about that. That would actually probably be more, combining these two things would take all afternoon. So we're going to stick with the left-hand side in blue. But again, you're going to see that there's a lot of material just in that area alone. All right, so first off, discussing the scope and what we're going to do. The green circle represents the topic of last year's discussion on zero trust, where we started with the NIST standard for zero trust, which is 800-207. We then looked at it in the context of the cybersecurity, the CISA's zero trust maturity model, which provides 4 different layers of maturity. And then we created an overlay discussion talking about how certain types of maturity were going to be more appropriate in an HPC environment and an HPC zone than others. And we used the NIST 800-223 as the framework for that discussion. So we're still going to present that material, possibly with a smaller concentration, because there's been a lot of development in the area of the original NIST security architecture 800-223. And that discussion, they've since released a security overlay as a companion document, which takes into account and looks at NIST 853 security controls, of which there are a lot. And what they haven't done is mapped this to a maturity level or to sort of a framework. And the framework that's become very prominent is the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is in version 2.0. And you see it spread across the HPC world it's popping up in many places in HPC. For instance, it is, maturity models are a prominent part of CMMC, which a number of prominent sites in the US are using as their guideline for security, but also in the world of operational technology, which is, controlling all the heat, cooling, and power that are running your gigantic clusters. The cybersecurity framework is prominent. So we'll discuss that. As I said, we presented this paper. You can download it right now, or you can go at a later time and grab it. It's a fairly large piece of work, 65 pages in total. The main body is 25, but this is an overlay that we composed looking at how HPC might fit with a zero trust architecture. And we'll talk about that in greater details. So onto HPC and some of the foundational ideas that drove us to consider zero trust in the context of HPC infrastructure, which of course includes AI and HPC workloads. Characteristics like the size of these data sets make them distinct from many enterprise systems, and the types of of processing being done, highly parallelized with GPUs, certainly often distinguishes HPC and AI from enterprise applications. The high performance being driven by the GPUs, but also the throughputs on the networks, the IOPS required from the storage systems, again, make them distinct from what you might find in a typical enterprise system. And a lot of the security standards have really been designed for enterprise systems with them in mind. And of course, there's also specialized hardware, not only these incredible GPUs, but also FPGAs and other sorts of hardware accelerations coming into play that you wouldn't find in everyday enterprise systems. Now, one of the areas that got me particularly interested in this, and by extension, Carleton's Critical Infrastructure Protection Center, is that around the world, when you look at HPC and AI infrastructure, particularly the type that is funded by government, you'll see that it's often being included or mentioned as part of their critical infrastructure. In the case of the United States, research infrastructure, particularly federally funded research infrastructure, is explicitly called out as something that's either covered as government infrastructure, sometimes it's infotech. But the importance of it in terms of protecting national prosperity, competitiveness, and investments is recognized. Similarly, in Australia, they actually are specific about calling out data centers and high performance clusters as a distinct infrastructure sector all by itself, coupled with the fact that the investments in research and education reflects a national level priority and something that warrants specific attention and protection by declaring it critical infrastructure. And by the way, when you have a designation as critical infrastructure, often what flows from that are additional considerations around funding or responsiveness or protection when it comes to attacks or recovery in the event of some type of natural disaster, or just really getting access to the resources you need to maintain normal operations under abnormal conditions or in the face of attack. So without those designations, you're sort of part of everybody else when these abnormal conditions emerge. The UK has done the same thing, where they have designated data centers and high performance clusters inside those data centers as national critical infrastructure. So in Canada, we are looking at an opportunity to revise our own definitions. And our hope is that the current C8 will actively provide better guidance around what is, for instance, part of telecommunications. Does it include data centers? Does it include high performance clusters? Does it include research centers that are federally funded? And if so, that would be an advancement in their protection and resilience. We wrote about this at Carleton. We published a blog. There was a Hill Times editorial about this 2 weeks ago, all in the run up to Bill C8. So take a look at that if you're interested. Hopefully this time next year, if we were to redo this, there might be some additional clarity, which would be great progress. So the last section that I'm going to cover, and then I'm going to hand it off to Daksha, is a little bit about the threat environment and the risk environment facing HPCI right now. I have a background in data center engineering, and I'm actually an NVIDIA InfiniBand professional myself, so I do work in data centers. But the number of vulnerabilities and exposures that are cropping up in components that are typically found in HPC and AI infrastructure continues to grow, and they're regular. So just looking at NVIDIA GPUs, in the last 2 years, there've been 6 CVEs released that have got high. There's anything over 7 is considered a high as a threat, requiring software updates and those sorts of things. The latest was in July related to some container breakout kits, and 9.1 is pretty severe. So that warrants administrative attention, and which of course means time and effort. Looking at some other components that you might find primarily in HPC environments, the Mellanox InfiniBand switches, IB switches. As recently as September of this year, there was a major update required. And for those of you that administer switches, you know that this generally requires a fair amount of time because you have to load new firmware. It requires multiple boots of the switches, and it also means that your cluster may need to pause operations unless you're fortunate enough to be resourced to have full redundancy in your switching infrastructure, which may or may not be the case depending on your budgets, because IB equipment is not free. Similarly, again, related to managing those Mellanox switches, which could be running Ethernet, or they could be running IB. The UFM has had some pretty serious vulnerabilities associated with it. Not too difficult to update, but you have to be aware of them, of course, and you have to set aside administration time. Fortunately, when the UFM goes down, you don't have to bring your cluster down. So that's not quite as onerous. If you're not using Mellanox switches, Juniper 2 is not immune from these sorts of issues. Lots of CVEs there. Supermicro chassis, if you're not using some of the other OEMs, they've had a number of issues with their baseboard controller firmware. and some of them are quite serious, actually. The most recent one being in September. And last but not least, an area that's often overlooked is data center infrastructure management. So these are the tools being used to control the heat, power, cooling, sometimes the physical access to a lot of these clusters. Increasingly, we're seeing that DSIM capabilities are coming into scope for AI and HPC infrastructure security considerations. Gartner's actually introduced DSIM as an element of competitive assessment when they're looking at their AI and HPC, what do they call those things, quadrants. So again, there's a few different players there. The one that's interesting is Schneider, which is an OT controller company going back a very long time, very prominent in industrial applications, but they've entered the data center world. And possibly unique among the vendors of DSIM software, they've had a couple of high-profile vulnerabilities reported. So be aware that whatever's controlling the OT inside your cluster has got the potential to represent an attack vector against your infrastructure, and attention is required. So at this point, Daksha, I'll turn it over to you. And do you need me to flip slides for you, or do you
Would you
have the
please?
capability yourself? Yeah, sure. You just let me
Thank
know.
you so much. I appreciate that. Yep. So why don't we roll to the next slide? So here we can see high performance computing infrastructure has seen its share of cyber attacks over the years. And 2016, which is almost 10 years ago, not directly infrastructure, but given this is a classic, we saw the AI poisoning of Microsoft's chatbot Tay. And Tay was a chatbot that went rogue and began posting offensive tweets through its Twitter account, causing Microsoft to shut it down in only 16 hours after its launch. And according to Microsoft, this was caused by trolls who attacked the service, as the bot made very offensive, provided offensive responses based on interactions with people on Twitter. So it was quickly taken down. Then in 2020, we saw a wave of cyber attacks that targeted numerous supercomputers across Europe. Compromised machines included the Archer supercomputer in the UK and several systems in Germany, Switzerland, and Spain. The attackers exploited an SSH connection, which academic researchers used to log into the systems remotely. And then once inside, the attackers deployed cryptocurrency mining malware. So a very traditional way in, and then HPCI was exploited. In 2021, the NetWalker ransom group persuaded the University of California to pay over $1 million in an extortion scheme using data encryption malware. And the institution, the officials actually say that they didn't even target the institution. It was just opportunistic. So essentially, like for HPCI, security by obscurity does not even work, right? So it is, people are taking advantage of any weak controls that they can find. So in the next, researchers demonstrated how low-cost, small-scale data poisoning attacks can compromise large web-scale AI datasets. It's like 0.1% has such a huge impact. And this demonstrated that the scale of HPC does not protect AI models from data poisoning. In fact, the sensitivity of the datasets makes them powerful, makes these powerful models like super vulnerable. And a single training run, as you might know, on HPC systems can cost millions of dollars. So a compromise to a data set, a tiny compromise, can render the entire effort and expense worthless. In 2023, Azure came out and acknowledged theft of service and resource hijacking and began offering various tools to detect it in HPCI environments specifically. So now it's firmly out there. And the tools involve advanced analytics that will help you detect suspicious activities like unauthorized resource usage of crypto mining and other malicious operations that you can find on HPCI. In 2024, we saw the GPU a container escape, and this is one of the CVEs that Tyson talked about earlier. And with HPCI, there's a lot of shared infrastructure, especially in multi-tenant environments. So the shared hardware resources can now be exploited with numerous users sharing the same GPU nodes in HPCI. Also in 2024, the Ukrainian hackers took out hundreds of Russian space research servers and supercomputers in Russia's Far East Research Center of Space and Hydrometeorology called Planeta. And they pretty much disabled the research center's supercomputers beyond recovery, taking out 2 petabytes of data and 280 nodes. And then this year, we see the Anubis ransomware group claim responsibility for a cyber attack on Advanced HPC, a US-based company specializing in high-performance computing systems for science and defense sectors. So the group stole sensitive internal documents and then threatened to leak them if their ransom demands were not met. So this is a highly targeted space by bad actors. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the major risks, as we just discussed, that you can have disruption of operations. If there's any kind of failure and disruption to operations, it costs a lot of money for HPCI in terms of both resources and expenses. You see corruption of data sets, which invalidates the entire study or research. And these data sets could contain sensitive financial information or PII data, which could get disclosed. And then theft of service, unauthorized workloads that use compute power for things like crypto mining and the like. And then again, GPU escape, which impacts multi-tenancy. And then the weak supply chain for HPCI. So there are a limited number of vendors in this space, and you see the same vendors in different combinations in HPCI infrastructure builds. So if there is a vulnerability through any of these vendors, they tend to cascade through the HPCI environment. There's limited diversification. Open source software we're all familiar with. They're widely used in research as well as in the infrastructure and management of the applications. And the DCIM and OT firmware that Tyson talked about, again, including power and cooling facilities, also present a risk. And then HPC overall has very specific challenges because they use very unique hardware and software and simulation, and they maintain configurations that are quite specific and not well vetted. So it presents an entirely new class of vulnerabilities and attack vectors that are absent in many traditional environments. So NIST put out its 800-223, which categorized the threats. Oh, thank you for opening that across multiple zones. It's a solid framework to review some of these threats and attack vectors that we have discussed so far. And again, a specific noteworthy call out is that they do talk about data center infrastructure network here quite specifically, and then we start to now slide into the OT domain space. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so interesting. So last year, Microsoft Digital Defense Report actually, are we able to zoom into that one? Actually notes that education and research was the second most targeted sector by bad actors. And you can see it's 21%, it's very close to the very top sector. And it also noted that the predominant attackers were nation states, which, as we know, are the most resourceful and sophisticated threat actors. And then in addition to that, what the irony of it is the bad actors were using these test beds to test their attack vectors before they actually launched the attacks. So continuing on from then onto this year's report, can we move to the other one, Tyson? You start to see again, research and academia is the third most targeted sector, and you start to see the percentages shift. It's just because they've accounted for it differently. So in that, the report goes on to say that the government bodies and IT, they manage the infrastructure and research and academia. So now we start to see HPCI the clusters start to go now horizontally across the top 3 sectors, which are, again, the most attacked, identified as the most attacked environments. So the report also notes that the complexity of research environments and the challenges around detecting and monitoring these attacks. And they do call out that with research in academia, it falls upon not just the professionals, but also the community at large to strategically defend and protect the environment. And then the disruption of this particular sector has cascading effects both upstream and downstream. So research in academia has now come into the prime target range, now holding steady for over 2 years, formalized through reports as the top attacked sectors. So even more reason we want to protect HPCI and as it's underpinning to AI models and its evolution. Can we let's move to the next slide. So Zero Trust has been very active for over a decade. I will go quickly over this, starting back in 2004 with the Jericho Forum, when we started talking about deperimeterization, then John Kinderwag formalizing it and introducing the term Zero Trust into the industry. And then, as you're familiar with, Google's Beyond Corp papers got published, and then NIST releasing its Zero Trust standards in 2018. And in the previous administration, we saw multiple executive orders in the US that prioritize Zero Trust, and also asking government or government departments to specifically comply to have plans and dates to meet Zero Trust architecture requirements. And in 2023, CISA released its Zero Trust maturity model to support this activity. It's basis of some of the work, research work that Tyson and I did, and we'll talk more about this later. And NIST has since released 800-223, which we've talked about. And 2025 has been a fairly active year, both in terms of NIST releasing its HPC security overlay paperwork, the Zero Trust architecture models, and the executive orders from this administration. There's a slight shift in that it loses the original timelines, but it still prioritizes Zero Trust architectures, and then moves squarely to prioritizing AI work and AI development in terms of cybersecurity. And additionally, John Kinderwag, the father of Zero Trust, has also started to shift some of the concept of Zero Trust, moving away from the legacy risk-based Zero Trust concept into more of an anti-fragile model. So Zero Trust is now expected to be dynamic, move away from the static state of responding to attacks, but becoming more resilient as a result of the attacks coming in, and building strength based on an adaptive approach. And of course, in Europe and the rest of the world, you see the other standards like DORA and NIST2 that continue to prioritize Zero Trust. So let's talk a little bit about Zero Trust by way of a very quick level set. Zero Trust is not a product or a service. We just want to make sure that's super clear. Zero Trust is a paradigm. It's a way of thinking about security. And in this diagram, it's just simply illustrating that, like in the past, you'd have a user come in, say on a full VPN, you get into an environment and they have full access to the entire environment. And with Zero Trust, it's all about authentication, authorization, microsegmentation. It's very specific to the user's role. There is containment. And essentially the concept being that a breach of an individual or a user should not breach the entire environment or breach the organization, right? It's all about compartmentalization and containment, and then managing the actual roles and authorization. So the three core principles to the right: never trust, always verify, the big one; least privilege, That's to manage the authentication and authorization, just-in-time access, and assume breach. It is about microsegmentation. It's about reducing the blast radius, and you continuously verify. So this is both about the authentication authorization as well as the device posture or the user's posture and other contextual data points that you would take into ensuring the continuity of the state of security and maintaining that posture. So let's go to the next slide. This is a very quick high-level outline presented by NIST in their standards. So it just evolves the concept that we just talked about. So to the left, you see all the data signals coming in, like the continuous data monitoring and industry compliance or the threat intelligence coming into the environment. The policy engine on the top sort of processes all this data and then makes a decision whether the subject should be given access to the resources on the right, which is the data and the systems. And the policy enforcement point in the middle is like the gate. It simply manages the connection and disconnecting when the user is done. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So I just want to leave you with a quick summary of what Zero Trust is not. It's not a product or a service or a solution that you can buy. It's not a certification. You almost have to do the work of shifting the paradigm. It's not a let's go into what is also, so I can go through this so we can get back into the core HPCI topics. It's a paradigm shift. It's not a rip and replace, so please don't panic. And Zero Trust is aligned with the overall security posture of the organization, and it works hand in hand with all the other security goodness of DevSecOps and security incident response and the rest of it. And Zero Trust will not bring you to 100% security. It never does, right? No paradigm does. It's about building the resiliency in the systems. So it's a shift in how you design systems from inside out. So it is about security architecture. And then to the right, we see the Zero Trust maturity model. And we are going to talk about this and more importantly, we're actually going to talk about this because we don't want to be in a position where we say, hey, we rolled out Zero Trust across our HPC cluster, and now every node asks for MFA before joining the MPI job. That's a joke. So with that, I just want to highlight the 5 pillars of ZTMM and the fact that we take the evolution from the traditional up through the optimal, and there's a methodology and a way to go about this. I'll turn it back to you, Tyson.
Okay, thanks, Daksha. We've still got about 26 minutes to go. I want to acknowledge Bill Turner. Thanks for all your questions, and I'll try and save at least 5 minutes at the end so we can get to them. To get specifically into the guidance, the document, if you haven't seen it, is NIST 800-223. It was released as a final piece of guidance in February of last year, and it's got some excellent material in it. It's intended to apply to all U.S. government agencies and federal entities, but it's more widely used in industry as well because it's rather unique in its guidance. At the core of it is a reference design which breaks the HPC and the AI clusters into 4 different domains. An access zone, which would be where the researchers would come in and they would log into nodes, possibly or probably via some type of jump box. And then this would be where they would perform their operations. They would prepare their software, and from here they would request jobs and schedules and things like that. But they wouldn't go beyond this zone. You've got a management zone on the bottom left, where administrators would be controlling the schedulers and the loggers and all types of other provisioning devices. And only administrators would have access there. The high performance zone, which is where you would have the GPUs and the HPC clusters. And those clusters would be interconnected by a separate network in most cases, a high performance network, either Ethernet or IB, I would say in almost every case, one of those. And that will go to the storage zone. And each of those zones has got different unique threats and properties, vulnerabilities, as discussed in 800-223. So that is an interesting piece of work. In the end, 223 comes out with some recommendations highlighting access controls and network segmentation as an important capability within especially the management network. And they also point out that that operational technology is sometimes present inside these management networks because they're accessing the chassis BMCs or the IPMIs for the out-of-band provisioning or black starts. And in this case, this really does bring OT into scope, especially if the OT itself is and is being used for power heat management on those clusters. More about that soon. Computer node sanitization. A lot of questions remain around that, and particularly with some of the container attacks right now. It's the recommendation is to be quite prescriptive about how GPU memory and other sorts of memory are cleansed between jobs and between researchers. Data protection, making recommendations around the use of encryption on storage systems where possible, but also recognizing that where encryption is going to reduce performance, then there's a balance that has to be found. And container security, we already spoke about that. The number of CVEs coming out in this area are seems to be accelerating. The other thing that is interesting, and it's been applied in many types of different situations, is the cybersecurity framework. So for those that aren't familiar with it, NIST CSF, it's in its second edition. And what it does is it takes the 287 controls that are present in NIST 853, which is the main standard for IT security controls, and it breaks them up into this framework of govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, which often map to different accountabilities and rules in an organization. And that makes it a little bit more digestible to start to understand who does what. So the CSF has become a popular tool to try and organize and manage security, but it doesn't have its own security controls. It refers to the security controls from NIST particularly. And what we've seen happen is, I'll come back, is that now the overlays associated with HPC and the NIST security recommendations, they themselves are creating a new sort of subset of controls that will probably benefit from having someone map the cybersecurity framework to it. The other thing to point out about all this guidance is that a lot of it derives from another document called FIPS 199, which categorizes things by security, looking at security objectives, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and what they call potential impact, where they'll talk about degradation in mission capability at low versus minor damage to assets or minor financial loss or minor harm to individuals, all the way to what they consider high, and they define in terms such as major damage to assets, loss of life, major financial loss. So these often get up into national security sorts of considerations. But the importance for this audience is that a lot of the overlays coming out tend to focus on moderate, and more importantly, NIST has come up with this HPC overlay, 800.234, which is in draft, but they're using this moderate definition. So if your systems are managing national security information, then this overlay document has not been tailored for those types of systems. It's been tailored for the moderate level, not, for instance, defense information, if you're doing research in that area, or information, if released, could, for instance, completely irrevocably damage the financial position of a company or something like that. Now, what it does more actionably is this overlay has got about 20 sort of amendments associated with things like access controls and risk assessment, what's RA, where they're providing specific guidance on how to apply the NIST standard to HPC. And this is interesting because the zero trust architecture that we're talking about, it too is based on this NIST 853. So there's almost two different frameworks that have become available for assessing and managing your HPC from NIST. One is the Zero Trust, where we've done the overlay mapping, and then there's this other emerging version of it, which is applying 800.234, but it doesn't have a maturity level or framework built around it yet. So Zero Trust still has got more meat on the bone when it comes to providing sort of management level guidance and providing some delineation around roles or responsibilities. Just one slide on this, but when it comes to the operating technology that's driving the HPC clusters, again, this is providing some interesting guidance. But if HPC is different from enterprise IT, then OT is a completely different world altogether. The acknowledgement of this is in the fact that NIST itself is saying that probably 20-25% less of the controls are applicable to OT. So you got about 225 out of 287 that can be applied. The others are not fit for purpose if you tried to use them in an operational technology environment. And then of the remaining 225, almost half or just over half, NIST is providing special guidance on how to implement them. So it is a different environment, potentially fragile, and caution is always required when you're doing any type of testing on it. They've even gone so far as to add new controls that are sort of specific to the OT environment. And one good one is that I like to take a look at is what they call CP12, and the requirement to come up in safe mode. So for a lot of industrial devices, if they fail, then the idea is that they fail in a safe mode where they could be closed or they could be opened depending on the situation, but they don't reboot back into a regular mode of operation ready for full production capability. They either fail safe or they boot safe, and that's something that NIST has actually added and prescribed from a HPCI perspective. If those sorts of configurations are present in your environment, then it's useful to know where they are and what they do to your heating and your cooling and your power, especially if, for instance, a safe mode is to fail closed. That would be an issue for a lot of the high density liquid cooling systems that are being put into place right now, for instance. All right, so the Zero Trust maturity model, which is a great reference point, it really comes down to whether or not you would strive to get to the highest level of maturity, which they call optimal, if you're running an HPCI cluster. And what our research turned up was two things: that the traditional level of maturity seems to be fairly common in the HPCI environment. And we'll explain what that means just a minute. And that's not bad. It's not a bad starting point. And in fact, the perception that most people are running at the traditional level is good, because certainly there can be cases where you don't even get to traditional. But what we also found is that each of those 5 pillars that Daksha talked about is going to be unique in its ability to get to compliance, or to optimal maturity, I should say, based on the novelty of the operational requirements inside HPCI. So what we'll do now, say in the next 5 minutes, and I'm trying to leave 10 minutes for Q&A, is take a look at what we found and what we published. So to begin with, if you look at the identity pillar, that's a little small, so maybe I'll just do it like this, is that the green indicates that most organizations are operating at what's known as the second level of maturity, the initial level of maturity, where multi-factor access control is in place. And you've got the hosts, or maybe there's an identity system which is unique to that cluster. What happens further on up the maturity level, though, is you start getting into situations where more sophisticated types of MFA are being required. And You get into automated risk assessments associated with login attempts, which involve context and more sorts of monitoring. And for a typical HPCI environment, where most of the budget, frankly, has been allocated to getting processing and speed, finding the resources after the fact to try and engage in these types of advanced identity controls is more of a challenge. And then in other cases, it just doesn't seem to be practical. Like, for instance, enterprise-wide identity and integration. That makes sense for enterprise systems, but if you're running a research cluster and you've got people coming in from all sorts of other research institutions across the country or around the world, then expecting that everybody is within the same identity and access control system or directory, if you want to put it that way, that that degree of federation hasn't been achieved in Canada. And as a result, trying to insist that somebody get there, to an optimal level of maturity for identity in HPCI will not reflect the reality of operations right now. We've got a slide in here discussing some of the types of products, but I'm not going to talk through each of these in the name of time. But it is part of the white paper, and certainly you've got this link, and we'll keep this link up indefinitely, really. The second pillar is management, is the management pillar. And in this case, what we figured is that there's really two types of sorry, it's the device pillar, but there's two types of considerations. There's management devices, or just management in general, and then there's workloads. And in the case of workloads particularly, where they're asking for a lot of tracking, a lot of labeling, enforced compliance, these types of things become a real problem, where you've got novel workloads being brought in by researchers who may be updating the software from run to run to fine tune it. And that's not really compatible with some of these more advanced types of device management features. So trying to continuously assess the inputs and outputs from these systems, access controls, doing real-time risk analysis on the devices themselves, especially in the high performance zone, it again wouldn't be compatible because you don't have a static workload that you get from a vendor and you run until the next update comes out. Some further examples of types of applications that might do this: host-based firewalls, endpoint detection and response. You're not going to be running any of those on a compute node. There's just no way, because of the CPU and the weight of those things. You might run them in the access zone, but that is I've seen I guess light versions of those types of controls put into place in access, but certainly not in compute, and certainly not in storage either. The network pillar, again, is sort of interesting because there's two assessments. One has to do with the management network, where, subject to budget and resources, a lot of controls could potentially be put into place that wouldn't interfere with performance, up to and including real-time microsegmentation based on requests and contexting and profiling. I mean, yes, it's possible, but the costs probably make it a difficult proposition, especially if the management network, for instance, is limited only to that cluster. The business risk versus the technical risk, i.e. the cost versus the actual vulnerability created, is subject to discussion. Where in the performance networks, so these would be either the InfiniBand, the IB network, or connecting compute to storage, or if you're running high performance Ethernet and Rocky or something like that, then a lot of the security controls would simply slow down the network to the point where workload performance could be impacted. The one that often comes up that I think would raise a flag immediately is the request to try and encrypt traffic. There are some proposals to encrypt it. There's a secure MPI proposal out there using encryption. There's some people that propose using IPsec between storage and the compute nodes. But the overhead associated with that will certainly have an impact that would probably generate resistance among both the researchers and the people who own the cluster and want to get as much out of it as possible. So again, the details are in the paper, but there are 2 networks in these HPC clusters, and they've got different abilities to actually function. And then, applications and workloads, similar story, slowing these workloads down by deploying controls in the compute environment is likely to meet resistance. By way of example, they're asking for immutable workloads with security testing integrated through the life cycle. And of course, the workloads could be changing from run to run to run as the researchers work. So those types of recommendations don't distinguish between a vendor product sold into an enterprise versus a workload from a researcher running on a high performance cluster. Some examples of tools in there that could be brought to bear, but the practicality at the higher levels of maturity is for discussion. And finally, the data storage pillar. Again, maturity at the lower levels seems quite achievable, where they're talking about potentially encryption of data at rest inside these repositories is fine, but some of the more optimized things like having encryption of data in use that could refer to confidential computing. It could refer to homomorphic encryption in processing, all of which have got pretty significant performance costs. There's certainly use cases where that may make sense, but for most of the high performance pillars or high performance clusters, it would probably represent an unacceptable performance impact, and therefore, it doesn't really become achievable from a security perspective. So when we summed it all up, the big picture was that from pillar to pillar under zero trust, different parts of the HPC cluster will have different abilities. And if you were asked to create a zero trust program, then at the micro level, you would, you'd feel confident about targeting things in green, and you'd ask for extra budget for anything in yellow. And you probably say, I'm not going to attempt anything in red. Conversely, if you just wanted to give a high level answer, as I said at the beginning, a traditional level of maturity for zero trust in HPC seems quite doable, seems to be where many people are operating now. And that, an ambitious level of maturity would be initial. And the research would back you up if that was the proposition you made to your management. Going into advanced or optimal levels of maturity for zero trust inside HPCI is going to reflect a lot of budget, and you encounter the law of diminishing returns quite quickly. In other words, you pour a lot of money in to make smaller and smaller gains towards optimum maturity. So with that, I'll just leave it at that for now because we've got about 6 minutes. I see Ryan's on. Ryan, did you want to take us through Q&A or?
Yeah, I'll just stop recording as we committed to at the beginning, just to preserve anonymity of people who might want to participate. So